The vast majority of men live lives of quiet desperation. Those were the words that Henry David Thoreau wrote as he sat on the banks of Walden Pond. He'd gone there to reflect on life and what it meant to just be. To live as a human being in the world, he observed the people around him and how they lived. And he wrote those words that we remember from Walden's Pond, his book. The vast majority of men and women live lives of quiet desperation. He saw that the people around him were struggling, trying to understand what it means to be human and to be and to live and what is my path in life and why was I created and who does God want me to be? The book of Genesis in the Bible addresses that kind of desperation. The book is, of course, we know it as Genesis, which is a Latin Vulgate translation of a Greek word for a Hebrew word. But have no fear, I can translate it from Hebrew into Okie. All right? I'll get right there for you. The book of Genesis really is, that word means how to be, or the book of how to be alive, how to live. It explains things like why were we created and why is work hard? Why do people hate snakes? I know my wife does, and I can go to the book of Genesis and look up and find out why she does. It also talks about why we live the way we do in our families. In fact, if you read the book of Genesis carefully, it's divided into 10 sections we call teratops. Each section has a story about family. And those stories are pretty tough. They're about family conflict. You think about Abel and Cain, there's a conflict for you, right? Right? Isaac and Ishmael, there's another conflict. One of them just tosses their family aside. Jacob and Esau. One brother, Jacob, robs his brother Esau, steals his inheritance. And then there's this story about Jacob's son, a man named Joseph. The Joseph of the Old Testament, Joseph in the New Testament's a different name, different guy. But this Joseph of the Old Testament, now his story is so big and so important in the book of Genesis that it takes a lot to tell it. The book of Genesis is 50 chapters. That's a huge book in the Bible. 1 out of 7 verses is about Joseph. So this guy is really important in the big scheme of things, right? In the Bible. This guy's story is a big deal. It's also the first story in the Bible where the word forgiveness is used. Now, it's been implied before in other stories, but this is the first place in the Bible where it's talked about specifically and that word is used. It's interesting to me that in the story, we'll unpack it here in a minute, it's not someone offering to forgive the first time that word is used. It's someone begging for forgiveness. That's the first time it's used. It's also interesting to me that this book that's so foundational that it'll center in Jesus' teaching and preaching, he'll talk about it a lot, that this book that is so important begins with that story of creation and then ends with the most climactic story in the book beyond creation, and that story is a story of forgiveness. That's how important it is in God's plan for us to understand this. So here's a book about families and origins and how families come to be. It tells the story over and over of family conflict, and it ends its lasting lesson that it wants us to take with us and incorporate it into our spiritual life is the story of forgiveness. Now you think about Joseph's story. It's a wonderful and a powerful story. It's a story of a young guy who grows up with at least 12 other brothers. We also know there was a sister involved. Now, my mom was the youngest of 13. And my mom was a very, very positive person in life. So she was the baby of 13. Think about that. Sharecroppers' kids. Dad died when they were young. raised by a widowed mother, 13 kids out west of Okarche. And she was a very positive, cheerful person. If she had a new dress and the dog jumped on it and got mud, she'd give thanks to God for the dog. I mean, that's just who she was, right? But one time I remember asking her, I said, Mom, what was it like growing up with 12 older brothers and sisters? And she looked at me, no smile at all, and said, it was hard. It was really hard. That's the most negative thing I ever heard my mother say. Right? We know what it's like to have those things in the family that are hard, really hard. And Joseph had that thing with his brothers. It didn't help that he was obnoxious. He was the favorite son. His daddy, Jacob, had 2 wives, different set of kids with each wife. He favored him over the other kids, which caused all kinds of problems. That's the way Jacob had been raised, if you go back and read the Jacob and Esau story. One child favored above the others. Joseph would have these dreams, and he would come and tell his brothers about them. I remember one in particular, he came to his brothers and said, guess what? I had one of my dreams last night. Are you all so excited to hear it? It's awesome. It's amazing. It's wonderful. It's why I'm different than all the rest of you, because I see visions and I dream dreams, and God speaks to me. And in this dream, my brothers, I dreamed we were all big sheaves of grain. The harvest had come, and we'd been gathered up, and you were a sheaf, and you were a sheaf, you were a sheaf, you were a sheaf, I was a sheaf. And guess what happens in the dream? All your sheaves bowed down before me and worship me. Isn't that the best dream you've ever heard? Imagine saying that to your older brothers, right? And he was always saying stuff like that. And finally, one day they were in the field and they saw him coming. He was wearing a fancy coat his daddy had given him. Nobody else in the family got a coat like that, but Joseph did. And one of his older brothers, he's not a great guy as we read his story, said, I am tired of him. I'm sick of him. I'm tired of being put down. I'm tired of him thinking that he's more important. I'm the oldest brother. They should be giving me the honor. Let's get rid of him. And they grab Joseph and they struggle with that. And there's a little moment of conscience there. And they decide, well, we won't kill him. We'll make a profit out of him. We'll sell him off into slavery. We'll take this coat. We'll dip it in animal blood. We'll go home. We'll tell Daddy he was killed by an animal. And we'll sell him into slavery. We'll get a few coins in our pocket. And this problem will be gone forever. And so Joseph goes and becomes a slave in Egypt. And then when you think things can't get worse, he's falsely accused of something. And he goes to prison. So he's gone from being the chosen child of the family to a slave to now in prison. And believe it or not, that's what makes Joseph the man he will become, is that experience of falling from on high, of being rejected by his brothers and falling. And he does this thing that I admire so much. He could have said, this is it. This is my path. Bad stuff's always going to happen to me. I'm never going to have a chance to get hit. This has all been decided. My family hates me. I've been falsely accused. This is just the way it is. But he doesn't do that. He says, I'm going to work, and I'm going to struggle, and I'm going to strive, and I'm going to lift myself up out of this. And that's exactly what he does. He has this amazing story. He becomes the head of the slaves, and then the head of Pharaoh's household. And then a man almost equal in power to Pharaoh. In fact, he runs the nation of Egypt, the greatest nation in the world in that time period. He's running the whole place. And 30 years into it, a group of guys come from the land of Canaan to beg for food because they're starving. Everybody goes to Egypt to beg for food during the great famine because Joseph, with his wisdom, his dreams, and his visions, he's seen it coming, and he's filled the storehouses of Egypt with grain. Remember his dream? He's prepared his nation. He's cared for his people. And these guys come from the land of Canaan to beg for food because they're starving to death. And Joseph sees them, and suddenly he realizes, it's my brothers. It's my brothers. There's Bubba and Billy Joe and Willie Bob and Chuckles. They're all here. The guys that beat me up and sold me off into slavery. that eventually led to something worse than slavery, me being in prison and being tortured and beaten. These are the guys right here, and right now they're begging me for help, and I got the power. Right? And it's this incredible moment when you get to stop as the reader of this story in Genesis, and you're supposed to sit back and wonder and go, what would I do? What would I do if I was given the opportunity to take justice into my own hands? What would I do if I got to claim vengeance against the people, especially the people in my family who have done me wrong? See, this is the deciding moment, not just for Joseph, but for his family. And he starts to ask these 10 brothers, he starts to, 9, actually one Benjamin stayed home, but he starts to ask them questions. And they're a little confused about the stuff he seems to know about them. They haven't recognized him yet. Maybe he grew a beard, I don't know. And so they discuss it among themselves, and they're speaking in Hebrew, and they don't know that he can understand every word they say because that's the language he grew up with. Right? And through a series of incidents and little maneuvers that he does, he eventually brings his brothers, all of them, including Benjamin, and his daddy to Egypt. And eventually he can keep the secret no more. And he reveals himself to his father and to his brothers. His brother Jacob breaks down and weeps and says, now I can die because the son I thought was dead is alive. My family has been restored. But you know, when Jacob was a little boy, he robbed his blind daddy. That's the kind of guy he is. And we're reading the story, and when he says, this is it, this is great, my family's restored, we're left wondering as the readers, is it really? Are you sure? We know you. We know your family. We know how you all do things. Are you sure this is all done? Jacob dies. And the other 10 brothers remember what they did. And so they go to Joseph with a story. Doesn't appear anywhere that Jacob was speaking, but they come with a story. Now, Daddy said, right? Any good Southern boy will react to 2 phrases. Daddy said, Mama said. Right? And these guys are from Canaan. They're from the South, so they're Southern boys. And they come and they say, now Daddy said that his dying wish, here's where the word first appears in the Bible, is that you forgive us. Is that you forgive us. Wow. Now, I have to take a little parenthesis here. I want to take you back to the story of Joseph's dad, Jacob and Esau. Remember the 2 brothers? Joseph robbed his brother Esau. Jacob robbed Esau of his inheritance. Eventually, Jacob had to go home. He lost everything. People were pursuing him, trying to kill him. He goes home. He hears that Esau's coming to meet him. And he thinks, my brother is coming to kill me. And instead, when the 2 meet, Esau forgives. Doesn't use that word, but that's what he does. Forgives Jacob. And Jacob looks at his brother Esau and says, in your face, I see the face of God. See, to forgive is to somehow let God live inside of you. It's really important to remember that story. It's a powerful, powerful story in Scripture. When Esau forgives Jacob, and Jacob says, in your face, I see the face of God. And now Jacob is dead. But his sons live on. And these boys have asked Joseph, their brother, the son of Jacob, for forgiveness. And Jacob remembers that long ago story that was a part of his family when his daddy was forgiven but couldn't believe it. You see, when Esau forgave Joseph, he couldn't believe it. He couldn't trust it. The family remained broken and shattered because he wouldn't accept forgiveness from his brother. And now Joseph looks at his brothers and he says, am I in the place of God? Do you want me to be like God? Because if that's the role you want me to play, I can play that, but you need to understand what that means. That means I'm going to forgive you totally and completely and love you as though this terrible thing had never happened. But if I play that role, then you have to play your role as well. You have to receive forgiveness. And you have to live as though this terrible thing didn't happen. It did. We all know it. We're not pretending it didn't. But we can't be tied up and bound to that. We have to have a new way forward as a family. There's a new path for us, if that's what you want. And then he says these words that we hear from the time we're little kids, I think. Joseph looks at his brothers and he says, what you intended for evil, God meant for good. Now, it's a very tricky statement. It's a very important statement. Jesus will refer to it. What you meant for evil, God intended for good. And sometimes you'll hear that preached and taught in the church, that God does bad things to people so that they can learn and grow spiritually. I don't believe any of that. And if you pay careful attention, that's not what this text says at all. He says, you intended to do something bad. But God has found a way, created a path for us to experience something good, because that's what God does. God enters the brokenness of our lives, the brokenness of our families, and creates these paths, these opportunities, these potentialities for us to move on beyond the hurt and the brokenness. But everybody has to accept that and move on together. Joseph looks at his brothers and says, our family was broken, it was hurt, it was crushed. But out of that brokenness, now God is giving us this opportunity to change everything. There's these moments in families that are transitional moments. Funerals, the death of someone, a marriage, the birth of a baby, all different kinds of things. Our families are put together like this. And in those moments, it sort of comes apart. And we have the choice and the opportunity to put that back in lots of different ways. It's up to us how that goes back together. You have to recognize those moments and be intentional about pouring yourself into it and allowing yourself to be led by God. And that's what this moment is for Joseph and his brothers. And it says here, these big redneck guys, warriors, fighters, soldiers. It's just that they just broke down and wept. Because there's this place in every family that when forgiveness comes, there can't even be words to describe it. The Apostle Paul said it, we moan and groan, and the Spirit intercedes for us. It's so deep, it's a part of our physical body, that need for forgiveness, healing, and reconciliation. These great and powerful men, these brothers, break down and weep together, and their tears are the bathing of their family and the washing away of the hurts of the past. Now, remember, the book of Genesis is the book of how to be. And what God is saying to us is this is how we're called to be. The people that weep and forgive and bring healing and allow God to create new paths and a new way forward in our life. It starts, though, you have to recognize the reality. You have to recognize what's there, the brokenness and the hurt, and the fact that we're inexplicably, to most of us, bound together with certain people in our lives we call family. When I was a little boy growing up, my grandparents, my parents, brother, and I, we all lived in the same 700 square foot house. One of my grandfather's retirement deals was he raised dogs. He raised boxers. We lived southeast Oklahoma City. It was a good place to have a guard dog. So he raised and trained boxers as guard dogs. And people would come to him from all over the place to buy these dogs. And one year we had one boxer puppy. If you know boxers, they stay a puppy their whole life, but still a little guy. He was an expert on escape, right? Called him Major. My folks are military, so we call him Major. He seemed to run everything. He was an expert on escape. No matter what we did, he got away. And when he got away, he loved to travel through the neighborhood, introduce himself to the neighbors. He was a fun-loving, happy guy. And one of the ways that he would celebrate visiting you is he would grab your trash can, turn it over, and spread your trash all over the yard. So I could always tell when he had been out. I'd be walking home from school, and I would see trash can after trash can after trash can turned over, and the whole yard filled with trash. And somewhere in the midst of the rubble, my little dog would be sitting there, And it was my job to go pick up all the trash. Some of us have that job in our families, don't we? We're the ones who pick up all the trash. It's not a very fun job. So I went to my dad. I didn't dare go to my grandpa. I didn't want to break his heart. I went to my dad, and I said to my dad, Dad, we've got to get rid of this dog. Grandpa's dog is driving me crazy. He's tearing up every trash can in the neighborhood. It's nothing but trouble. He's nothing but trouble. We got to get rid of this dog. My dad didn't say a lot, but when he did, it was usually important. He looked at me and he said, Son, Junior, I'm going to tell you what. He may be a scoundrel, but he's our scoundrel. And right there in that moment, my dad taught me one of the most important things I ever learned in the house I grew up in, the house of my Genesis. I learned that no matter what you did in our family, you were going to be forgiven and loved. That no matter how big a scoundrel I could be, and I was a pretty big one at times, I was still their scoundrel. I still belonged. Which brings me to the second point. As people of faith, as Christians, we're called to create in our homes a culture of forgiveness. That's what my dad was doing. He taught me that in our family we loved and forgave each other. He practiced that in every way, as did my mother. I learned in our house that it was okay to make a mistake. You owned up to it and you would be forgiven. And you got a second chance, a third chance, a 10th chance, a 20th chance, etc. In your home, you're called as a follower of Jesus Christ to create a culture of forgiveness. You see, that's the decision that Joseph made. When he looked out at his brothers and he said, you want me to take the role of God in this family? Well, let me tell you what that role is. It is to forgive. If you're going to be a follower of Christ, if you're going to take that role, then it means you're going to create a culture of forgiveness in your family. You're going to teach your children, your grandchildren to do that. You're going to practice that every day. You're going to be committed to it. And that's the final point. To live a life of forgiveness is to commit yourself to forgiveness. You remember last week, many of you came up to the altar and you laid a little tiny stone. There's a lot of stones in here. Little tiny stone on the altar as a way of saying you wanted God to make forgiveness a part of your life. We've taken these stones and we've laid them here on the altar table. As you remember, this represents the hands of God. We've taken your hopes, your dreams, your prayers, your cry out to God that God would create and bring forgiveness to your life. We've placed all of that in God's hands. Because we're making a commitment as a congregation, as a community, to forgiveness. And the place you begin with that is in your family. I know a powerful story about a guy named Jake, not his real name, who at 13 watched his family being torn apart because of his dad's infidelity. His dad was not faithful to his mother. And eventually it led to their divorce. And Jake didn't see his dad for 20 years, just occasionally, once every 2 or 3 years. And it made Jake bitter and angry. And he believed that every bad thing that happened in his life was because of his dad and what his dad had done to the family. And Jake was living his life, and he had a really good friend, a great Christian brother, and every one of us needs that Christian friend who can hold us accountable. And his friend went to Jake, and he said, Jake, I need to tell you something. He said, I've been watching you lately. I see you making excuses and not going home in the evening when work's over. I see you flirting with the women in the office. I see you making excuses not to go to your kids' activities and stuff. Jake, I'm afraid of what you're becoming. You're becoming just like your dad. And it just devastated Jake. That was the one thing in the whole world he never wanted to be. And so he started to pray about it, and he was asking God, what is the way forward for me? And God led him to call his dad. And he went and he met his dad in a little restaurant. And instead of accusing his dad or blaming his dad or venting all his anger, which would have been okay, instead he just said, Dad, I just want you to tell me your story. I want to know who you are. His father stammered at first. He was unsure how to proceed, but eventually with Jake's encouragement, he began to tell Jake his story. And he talked about where he had failed in his life and how he knew that he had hurt other people and how he lived this horrible kind of existence knowing he had hurt the people he loved and wanted to be loved by the most, but he had isolated himself from them through the things he had done. Jake saw his daddy in a different way, a way he'd never seen him before. He saw his dad as a human being, as a person just like him who struggled and sometimes made terrible mistakes and who was seeking some kind of meaning in life. He saw his dad as one of those people leading a quiet life of desperation. And Jake realized that he could heal at least a small part of his dad's life. He could lift that burden from his dad, maybe just a little. And he forgave his father. He not only forgave his father, but he lived as though his father was forgiven to him. He developed a relationship with his dad. He brought his dad into his children's lives so that his dad could finally know his grandchildren. 24 months to the day when Jake first sat down in that cafeteria with his dad passed away. And Jake stood at the grave and mourned the loss of a man he loved. A relationship he would have never had without forgiveness. Our calling is to live out the part of God that's in us every single day with the people around us who love us the most, to reveal God to them through forgiveness. This is the word of God in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. It's a funny thing. There are these moments, too, in church life, just like there are in family life. And this is one of those moments. It comes at the end of every